Good evening, everybody. I'm Amelia.
Tom,
We're here in the hot city of Dayton, Ohio. It must be in the 90s today. It's definitely July. Tom and I went this morning and snaked through a line at the Mega Baptist Church this morning, got ourselves tested for COVID-19. So that was something different about today. We feel fine, but we just wanted to double check things. So we're here today to bring you another story from the lectionary for this coming Sunday, which is Matthew 13, 1 to 9, and then there's a gap, 18 to 23. So in July, the next 3 Sundays, we have various parables of Jesus. And then the last, I guess it's August 2nd, we get the story of the feeding of the 5,000. So Tom's going to tell you the story now of the parable of the sower.
so that same day when he had been talking with John about John the Baptist and unclean spirits, Jesus came out of his house and sat on the shore. And such large crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and he sat in that. And the crowd were all standing on the beach. And Jesus taught them many things in parables. And he said, "Listen, a sower went out to sow. And as he sowed, some of the seed fell along the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Other seed fell on rocky ground where it had not much soil, and immediately it sprang up because it had no depth of soil. But when the sun rose, it scorched it, and since it had no roots, it withered away. Then some of the seed fell among the thorns, but the thorns grew up and choked it, and it yielded no grain. And some of the seed fell on good soil, and it bore fruit and yielded grain. In some cases, 100-fold, in others 60, in others 30. Whoever has ears to hear, let them hear." So, hear then the parable of the sower. Whenever anyone hears the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away the word that has been sown in the heart. This is the seeds that are sown along the path. But of the seeds that were sown on rocky ground, those are the ones who hear the word and receive it with joy. But a person like this has no roots. And while they endure for a while, when trouble or persecution arise on account of the word, immediately they fall away. And these are the seeds that are sown in the thorns. These are the ones who hear the word, but the cares of the world, the lure of wealth, enter in and choke the grain, and they yield nothing. And as for the seeds that fall in good soil, these are the ones who hear the word and understand it, and they bring forth fruit, bearing, in one case, 100-fold, in another 60-fold, and in another 30-fold.
There you have it.
That's today.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. This is just a parable. So what is a parable, pray tell?
Well, a parable's a metaphor. In this case, in Jesus' case, it's almost always, a metaphor for the kingdom of God. And so he's always thinking metaphorically about the character of the kingdom that is coming. But they are also wisdom sayings. So Jesus stands in the tradition of wisdom and of the issuing, the speaking of wisdom sayings that capture, in his case, the character of the kingdom of God. They're great metaphors. They really stick.
Okay. So these great crowds that heard Jesus tell this parable, what was it like for them?
Well, these were peasants. And so they came to hear him because they were interested in the kingdom of God. They had looked forward to the establishment of the kingdom of God as an independent state, not ruled by the Romans, but where they could be free, where they would not be so encumbered by debt and by Roman oppression. And so Jesus' teaching about the kingdom of God was so different that it raised hope in them. And so they came to hear about what it was saying and what Jesus was saying about the kingdom of God.
You mentioned they were peasants. So is that why Jesus talked about, he used this rural metaphor? Because we're not, at least most of us don't know a whole lot about the mechanics of farming, and certainly not the mechanics of ancient farming. And talk a little bit about the kind of details of this parable.
Yeah, well, the way that things were organized was there was a village in the middle, and then the farms were all around the ground. And so somebody then, to get out to their fields, they'd walk through the fields of everybody else before they got to their field. And so there were paths through the fields. And the ground in Galilee was not very good. There was a lot of thin soil, and there was a lot of weeds and big thorns that would grow up, and thorn bushes that would grow up in the midst of the grain and choke out grain in areas of the field. So everything that Jesus is talking about in this parable is an experiential reality for the peasant farmers who were the primary audience who he was talking to. So when he talked about the seeds being sown on the path and the birds come and ate them up, that's what happened to every farmer. And likewise, the stuff that would grow up in the thin soil, that was hopeful. And if they had a lot of rain, that stuff would yield grain. But when the sun comes out and it's scorched and there was heat and no rain, it just dry up. And so also with the thorns. So existential about the realities of farming. And then the expectation and the surprise of this, wherever there's hyperbole, that's the point of comparison to the kingdom of God. And in this case, a good yield from a farm is tenfold. As you'd plant one bushel, and for every bushel you planted, you'd get 10. 15 was great. Jesus starts off with 100-fold, 60-fold, and 30-fold. Well, 30-fold, the least that he identified, is twice as much as a farmer would expect for. So clearly, this is about the kingdom and the fruit that is being born and coming to life in the kingdom. And that's what the kingdom will do, is to bring forth these incredible harvests.
Okay, I still want to stick with these little rural details. What is a fold?
Well, a fold is the multiplying of bushels. So 100-fold is 1 bushel planted, 100 bushels in the harvest. 60-fold is 1 bushel, 60. That is the yield. So fold means yield.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that.
Yep.
So what is Jesus saying about the kingdom of God here in your estimation?
Well, he's saying on the one hand that the kingdom and the fruit of the kingdom will far exceed any expectations or hopes that people would have for the fruit of the kingdom of God. And in the interpretation of the parable that he gives, it is the expectation, it is the fruit, it's the possibility of what will happen when somebody hears the word of the kingdom and tells it, lives it, does it. And so that he is talking about, that he connects with it in his interpretation, is the fruit of those who hear the word and do something about it, and in whom it grows up and brings forth continuation of the story, the telling of the story, being disciples who would also tell the parables of the kingdom to others. That's
right.
Bearing fruit of the kingdom.
It seems to me, if I were a farmer and planted all these seeds and most of them didn't yield anything for this reason or that reason, or this reason or that reason, it would be very discouraging. So is there anything, is Jesus, I don't know, does he have a word about discouragement or
Well,
how to handle that?
there were, that's a connection between then and now. There were a lot of things that were really discouraging in Jesus' day. The taxes were out of sight. Famines were frequent. People were regularly, in various ways, oppressed by the Roman soldiers. There was a lot to be discouraged about, and peasants, especially, they had a bad year, or there was a claim on a debt that they had to pay and they couldn't pay it, they had to sell their farm in order to pay the debt, and they'd lose their farm and they'd become then tenant farmers who had to rent from wealthy landowners and give a major part of their harvest to their landowner. So there were a lot of things to be discouraged about then. There are a lot of things to be discouraged about now. And I probably don't have to go into the details of those, but that's what Jesus was addressing, was that reality of discouragement, defeat, hopes broken, things that were very, very hard to deal with then and now. I guess one way to put it is that there were a lot of, they wouldn't have ever used this term, but there were a lot of them who were depressed and discouraged and by the realities of life in this age, in this evil age. That's the way Jesus talked about it.
I notice that Jesus begins and ends this parable with a call to listen. Although I think at the end it was phrased as "Let those who have ears to hear hear." I think that's what you said.
Listen, yeah.
But both ends, it's framed with this invitation or command, more like a command to listen.
Yeah.
Is he talking then also about how we listen and making a case for how we ought to listen?
Yeah. Well, this is each one of the things that he names, so as for the seed sown on rocky ground, this is the one who hears it and receives it with joy, but such a person has no roots. And so when trouble or persecution arise on account of the word, they have no roots. They fall away. This is an invitation for each of Jesus' listeners to examine themselves. And what kind of a hearer of the word do I understand? Am I like seed sown on rocky ground, who, gives up on all this kingdom stuff when trouble or persecution arise? So the strength of this parable is the way in which it addresses the existential realities of listening and of Jesus encouraging each of his listeners to examine themselves and the way in which they be seeds, fruit, bear fruit for the kingdom of God.
So it's kind of both sides. It's both those of us who want to try to talk about God's way, God's kingdom, however it is that we talk about that in these days. Not to be too discouraged if it does not fruit, but also then to think for ourselves, how are we hearing the messages that Scripture and the faith community have for us?
Right. Yep.
Anything else you want to share with folks?
Well, it's also kind of an encouragement for those who are telling the stories and who are picking up and remembering what Jesus taught and who are then being his disciples and telling them, because a lot of times the people who they would talk to wouldn't understand, wouldn't respond, or they'd respond for a little while, but then they'd get tired of it. Forget all this kingdom of God stuff. And so it was also encouragement for them about the realities of being a disciple of the kingdom of God. And
okay, well, I think that's
really neat.
That's it for this evening. Have a great week.
Okay.
Tell the story of the kingdom of God.
Yeah,
Don't
that's
get
right.
discouraged if people don't pay attention.
Yeah, well, when things get discouraging with politics, with the environment, with the COVID-19, remember the kingdom of God. And it's a bigger picture. And God will bring good fruit out of all this disaster. So,
Bye, everybody.
bye.